Okay, for today's topic, I want to do something a little bit different than what we usually do, a little different than standard fare, but I think that it plays well with a few different themes that we've discussed recently. First amongst them is we've spent a significant amount of time discussing the Sanhedrin and the Bittul Sanhedrin at the end of the Bayis Sheni, and the diminished power of the Sanhedrin, the idea of Makin Va'inchin Shalem and Hadin, when a temporary Sanhedrin or a temporary Dayana situation is allowed to punish people. And Emir Hashem in the future will discuss the attempts at reconstituting the Sanhedrin over history, during the Ga'inim period, during the Gedolei Achronim, during more recent times, Napoleon, Eretz Yisrael, and we'll discuss the different machleksim that arose surrounding that. Now, additionally, when we spoke before Rosh Hashanah, we discussed the Takanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. When we discussed the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah in regards to blowing a shofar on Shabbos, we discussed the Takanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that they would blow shofar b'yavne. Now, that takana is one in a series of many takanas, and I thought that it would be an opportune time to discuss Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, to understand who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was, the tkufa that he lived in, the special role that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, occupies in the chain of Meisrei HaTorah, and use that as a bridge between what we've learned about the Sanhedrin so far and what we'll continue to learn. So I think that the most appropriate way to start discussing Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's life is to start with his death and work our way backwards. So I want to start with the Gemara in Brachos and Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara brings as follows. It says when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got sick, and he was, on his deathbed, he was ready to move on. So it says, "Ukishichala Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, nechnesu talmidav levakra." His talmidim, like we'll see later, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a primary rebbe. Who his talmidim were and what their milas were is delineated in the Mishnayos and Pirkei Avos. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's talmidim came in levakra. Kivin sherai some hischa livkais. When he saw them, he began to cry. Now, why exactly he started crying is a point of some contention, but he began to cry. Amrulay Talmidav, his Talmidim told him, Ner Yisrael, and pay attention to the details here, there's three milas that they attribute to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ner Yisrael, Amud Hayamini, Patish HaChazak. The Ner Yisrael, the candle of Klal Yisrael, the strong pillar and the hammer. Why are you crying? Amrulahem, he told them as follows, Ilu lifnei melech basar v'dam, hayu melichanaysi. If they were bringing me in front of a king who's a human, Shahayim kan u'machar bakever, today he's alive, tomorrow he's dead. Shem koyes alai ein kasei kaseilim, v'moisreini ein isuri yisraelim, v'mamiseini ein misasim yisraelim. Any repercussion, any einish that a king of flesh and blood could inflict on me is temporary by nature. He's not someone who lives forever. It's possible for me to change his mind, this king of flesh and blood. And to bribe him with money. But if I was facing a big court date, I'd cry. Who lives forever and ever. If Hashem is angry at me, and I can't be mefayis, there's nothing I can do, so Allah's kam v'kam, for sure I should cry. He says, and I see in front of me two drachim, shnei drachim, achas shal Gan Eden, achas shal Gehenim, ve'eni yedea be'ezem elichim I see. I don't know which way they're taking me, v'loi evke? You think I shouldn't cry? So that's the end of that conversation. So Amrullah, the Talmidim tell him, Rabbeinu barcheinu, give us a bracha. Amrullah, yiratzin shetei meir shemayim aleichem kemeir basav adam. He says, you should be lucky that the fear of heaven should be the same on you as the fear of your fellow man. Okay, then the Gemara continues, and the Gemara says, B'shas p'ti rasai, at the moment of death, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's neshama was leaving this world, Amr lahem, he turns to the Talmidim and he says, Panu kelim, take the kelim out of the house, b'pnei atoma, because I don't want them to become tamei, v'hechinu kisei l'chizkiyo melech Yehuda sheba, and prepare a seat, prepare a chair for Chizkiyo, Melech Yehuda, who's coming to be here now at this time. Now Rashi tells us, Chizkiyo Melech Yehuda Sheba, Rashi says, Sheba Elai L'Lavoisai, he's coming to accompany me. Chizkiyo is going to be my bodyguard as I enter the Olam Amis, the world to come. Now, this is a very strange feature. Aside from the fact that what exactly Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was crying about and what his fear was, which the Maharsha discusses and others discuss, but what's this sudden appearance of Chizkiyo HaMelech to be Malave Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to the Olam Amis? So the Tzlach in Brachos, Chav Ches Amud Beis, the Tzlach has an interesting. There's a few terutzim that I give him, but the Tzlach has an interesting teretz that I want to discuss. The Tzlach says as follows. He says, I think Nirlin is daiti that the reason why he says Chizkiyahu was just a messenger from amongst the kings of Malchus Beis David. One of the Malchus Beis David was sent to greet Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai because what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was crying about and what he was fearful of was that he had usurped the power of the Nasi. The Gemara says in Ksubis and the Samach Beis that from the time that Hillel became the Nasi, it always went from his children to, who Hillel was an anikel of Malchus Beis David, and it always went to his children, the Nasias. And during the Tkufa of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's life, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai usurped the Nasias, and explains the Tzlach why is that. He says because Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the Nasi before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he's one of the Asarei Hurugei Malchus. This we're talking about in the time of the Churban, and he was put to death. And his son Rabban Gamliel, who was going to eventually be the Nasi, he was either too young or was in hiding due to the wars that were going on in Eretz Yisrael. He was part of the leadership; he had to hide. So in that interim period between Rav Gamliel and between Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Gamliel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai becomes the Nasi. He usurps the seat of the Nasi to the and it's an extremely consequential Nasi. He institutes many gzeris and takanas and has a outsized role in shaping Klal Yisrael. And that's what I want to discuss. But what the Tzlach is saying is that what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was fearful of is that he kind of stole the Nasias from the Zarei Shel David, from the house of David, and he was afraid that he'd be punished for that, or that the David HaMelech Alein would have tainus on him. So B'shas Misasei, Chizkiyahu HaMelech comes as a messenger from the Malchus Beis David, as if to say, don't worry, we have no tainus on you, you're welcome. And says the Marsha as well, and additionally to say, but now it's time to return the Nasias back to the Malchus Beis David. We're coming to claim back what's rightfully ours. Now, just by way of explanation, the Gemara in Sanhedrin and the Daf Hey Amud Aleph says that the Nasias and the Reish Galusa was the leader of the Jews in Bavel, and the Nasi is the leader of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael in the Tkufa after the Churban. These are a kiyum of the pasuk of Le'yasser Shevet Mi Yehuda M'chayik Mi Bein Raglav. This is like the modern day edition of Malchus Beis David. The Rambam in Hilchas Sanhedrin in Parak Aleph Halacha Gimel, the Rambam explains the tzura of the Bezdin Agadol. The Rambam says as follows. The Rambam says that Kayvim B'tchila Bezdin Agadol B'mikdash. The first and primary Bezdin that Klal Yisrael has to have is the Bezdin Agadol B'Yerushalayim in the Beis HaMikdash. V'hu Nikra Sanhedrin Gedola. That's called the Sanhedrin Gedola. Meninon Shivim Ve'achad, Minyanam Shivim Ve'achad. The number of Dayanim that are on that Bezdin are 71. Shenemer Asfali Shivim Ish Miziknei Yisrael. In the Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu was gathering together the initial Sanhedrin, the first Sanhedrin, Hashem says, gathered together 70 men, Miziknei Yisrael, and Moshe al-Gabeim, and Moshe Rabbeinu was placed on top of them. Shenemer v'syatzvu shamimcha reshivim ve'achad. All together, that's 71. Now says the Rambam, Hagadol b'chachma shebekulon, v'shivin oisei roish aleim, v'hu roish yeshiva, v'hu shekairin oisei chachamim, nasi b'chal makim. The 71st, the one who's on top of all the 70 Dayanim, the biggest one, he's who's called Nasi b'chal makim. V'hu tamet tachas Moshe Rabbeinu. He's in place of Moshe Rabbeinu. And then we put the next one, who's the Av Bezdin, then Kol HaGadol Mechaveri sits closer up, and the Rambam continues charting out exactly how a Bezdin of Shivim V'echad. But now the Gemara tells us that from the times in Hillel and on, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, this position of Nasius, of being in charge of the Ziknei Am, went to Malchus Beis David. Came until Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who at the time of the Churban steps into this role, and at the time of his death being fearful that perhaps stepping into this role was an Aveira, he's crying and he's afraid, and Chizkiyahu HaMelech comes to comfort him and say, no, don't worry, you're good. You're coming, you're in the right place. Now, incidentally, what the Tzlach is mentioning, I'll just a digression here for a second, what the Tzlach is mentioning, that during the time of the Churban, being from the family of Beis David, what was a difficult role to be, we have in even non-Jewish history books, where we have documented that Aspusianus, who was the general who actually conquers Yerushalayim, he was mitzaveh after the kibush of Yerushalayim to hunt out any member of the Davidic line, find any member of David HaMelech's family, and wipe them out so that they shouldn't be able to rejuvenate the kingdom, so that kings and princes and even grandsons and nephews and anyone who's related to David HaMelech should be destroyed so that they shouldn't be able to re-establish Malchus Beis David. L'maisa, Aspusianus was not super successful, and even Bizman Hazeh, we have like a whole list of familial names that are in their mishpacha, they're miyuchasim to Malchus Beis David. For example, the Horowitz family, that the Hafla and Rav Shmelka of Nikolsburg and the Maral was part of that family. In their Yichus tree, they ascribe themselves to Malchus Beis David. The Luria family, the Marshal, Rashi, the Peretz family, the Friedman family, the Ruzhiner Rebbes, all the Friedman family ascribe themselves. I think the Alter Rebbe of Chabad and his Einiklach, the Marshal, we said this, but many different lines in Klal Yisrael ascribe themselves to Malchus Beis David and have one form or another of Yichus Buch that that track their history all the way back. And the Aspasianus wasn't successful, but Al Kapanim in that temporary moment, in the shadow of the Churban, steps in Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to take over the seat of Nasi of Reish Bezdin, and he's an extremely consequential figure in this role, and he's the one who Ki'ilu prepares Klal Yisrael to head into Galus and to face the Galus and not just saving them physically, but also saving them spiritually with his takanis and his igeres that we'll talk about. Now, let's just talk about, before we start that, we should chart who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was just as a person, as a Talmud Chacham. So now, before we move on to what exactly Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's stellar and role and impact on Klal Yisrael was, let's just talk about who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was, as a Talmud Chacham, as a person. So the Gemara tells us that Hillel had 80 Talmidim, Pei Talmidim, I think, Hillel Azaken, and of them, Shloishim Mehem Ru'uyim Shetishra Lehem Shechina K'Moshe Rabbeinu. 30 of them were worthy to have the Shechina sharing them like Moshe Rabbeinu. Shloishim Mehem Ru'uyim Shetamad Lehem Chama Ki Yeshua ben Nun. 30 of them were worthy of the sun standing still in its tracks like Yeshua ben Nun. Esrim Beinanim. 20 of them were Beinanim. Now amongst those, says the Gemara, Gadol Shabakulan Yonasan ben Uziel, and on him the Gemara says, Kol Oifa Pereach, any bird that flew over his head would burn up instantly. And Katan Shabakulan, the smallest one of all Hillel's Talmidim, is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And on him, on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Gemara says, the Gemara in Sukkah, Amru alav Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Shalehiniach Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Halachas, Agadas, Dikdukei Torah, Dikdukei Seifrim, Kalim v'Chamurim, Gzeir Shavis, Tkufis Gematrius, Sichas Malachi Ashares, Sichas Shedim, Sichas Tekalim, and the list goes on. Davar Katan, Davar Gadol, which means Ma'aseh Merkava and Havayis Dabaya and Rava. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was he's demarcated as the Katan Shebukulim Talmidei Hillel Azaken, and at the same time he seems to be quite expert, quite a bucky in all Chalakim of Torah, to the point that Hillel B'Shas Misasei says about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he's the L'hanchel Oiva Yesh V'Yitzreseim Amala, is referring to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Kilu, you're going to be the future. You're going to be the one who brings Torah to the next star. The Gemara elsewhere tells us that Rabbi Yochanan was never Sach Sichas Chulin, V'lei Holach Arba Amas B'lei Torah B'lei Tefillin. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was, the Gemara spends a significant amount of time describing the stature of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai also, before he was a Nasi, was a Rebbe. And the Mishnayos and Avos describe to us the Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And I don't think that's beyond the purview of today's discussion, but the Mishnayos and Avos spend a little bit of time, Chamisha Talmidim Hoyle Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and just to list their names, it's Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes, Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Asanov, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, and then each one of them has their milas, and that's not for now, but B'chalev and Shia, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Meiser HaTorah who transferred the link from Hillel Hazaken to the next star of Talmidei Chachamim, to all the Talmidei Chachamim who is Talmidim, the 5 Talmidim. Now, let's talk about the role Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai occupied during the terribly tragic time of the Churban, and how he was the one who stewarded Klal Yisrael forward from the Tkufa of the Bayis to the Tkufa of Galus, and how he showed them how they would have to be. So the first place to look is the Gemara in Gittin, on Daf Nun Vav, where the Gemara brings the story of Aspasianus and the Churban of Yerushalayim, and the outsized role that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai plays. The Gemara in Gittin, Daf Nun Vav and Beis, Nun Vav and Aleph, Nun Vav and Beis, tells us the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in the Churban. So it tells us that Abba Sikra Reish Bar Yoni de Yerushalayim, Abba Sikra, who headed the faction of the Bar Yonim, the Sikrikim, the ones who wanted to fight the Romans and battle the Romans, who ultimately led to the destruction of Yerushalayim, Bar Achse de Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai have. He was a nephew of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sent him a message to come to him and inquire, and he asks him, the whole world's going to die of hunger. What's going on over here? So he says, Abba Sikra tells him, Amalei Maya Evid, what should I do? He says, this has gotten away even from me. I'm not in charge. If I open my mouth, they're going to kill me too. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai proposes a solution where he's going to pretend that he died, and his Talmidim will carry him out, and he'll go have a secret meeting with the Romans who are camped out outside Yerushalayim and try to bring some shalom. So the Gemara tells us that they pretended to be carrying out his mitzvah, the Rishua mitzadachar, kimata lepischa. They wanted to test it. The Talmidim did not allow them to test it until Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, sneaks out of Yerushalayim, and he arrives at the Roman camp. So he says, Shlama Loch Malka. He tells the governor, the general, Aspasianus, Shlama Loch Malka. Amalei Mechayves Trey Katala. He tells him you deserve to be put to death for two reasons. Chadad Lav Malka and Avikarsli Malka. First of all, I'm not a king and you're calling me a king. And second of all, if I'm a king, what took you so long to come? And this discussion is a famous discussion where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai goes to meet him, and eventually, upon finding favor in the Romans' eyes, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai succeeds in salvaging something for Klal Yisrael, and he asks for 3 requests. And he asks that Tainli Yavne v'Chachamel, give me the yeshiva in Yavne, so that we can continue to teach the Torah and train Klal Yisrael properly. Give me Rav Gamliel u'Mishpachtai, the Mishpachas Nasi he wants, and he also asks for a doctor to heal Rav Tzaddik, who had been fasting for all these years, and like the Gemara tells elsewhere. So, from a physical standpoint, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai plays an extremely important role in salvaging Klal Yisrael. If not for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, it's hard to know how Klal Yisrael would have had a tekuma. How would there have been a yeshiva, a Nasi, a Bezdin, a Sanhedrin? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai single-handedly saves Klal Yisrael by salvaging the Beis HaNasi, and by salvaging the Leim de Torah, the Karen B'Yavne, and by salvaging Reb Tzaddik. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saves Klal Yisrael so that it can continue to go on to the next generation. Now, once the Olam moves to Yavne, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai assumes the role, at least if not in the exact name. We don't see Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai called the Nasi, but he certainly assumes the role of the Nasi. Ad kedei kach that the word Rabban, the title Rabban, is not used to describe Tanoim who are not Nasiim. It's usually reserved for a Nasi. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has the title Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, which indicates that he served the role of a Nasi while he was in Yavne, in the Karen B'Yavne. Now, while Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was serving in this role as the Nasi, so he imparts many, many important lessons to Klal Yisrael, which become kind of the roadmap as Klal Yisrael is heading out into Galus, as Galus sets in, and Klal Yisrael is going to learn to live with the new reality without a Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one who prepares them and teaches them how to face that reality. Now, just before the real Iker Takanas that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai makes, the Takanas of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that are brought down in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah and the Gemara in Sukkah, elsewhere, we'll get into those in a minute. Those are more of sugyas that we're not going to go into in detail. But there's one Nakuda, the Mishnah in Avester of Nasin, I believe it's in Parak Dalid, brings that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he told the Olam, it used to be that we were in the Beis HaMikdash, we had karbanos that were mechaper for us. Now karbanos are not mechaper for us anymore, and we're alone. We have nothing to be mechaper for us. He says the only thing that's left that could be mechaper for us like karbanos is gemilas chasadim. He says achshav, all we have is gemilas chasadim to be a kapara for us. So interesting to me, like the on the way out to Galus, one of the primary messages that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would want to impart to Klal Yisrael is take care of each other. Is that chesed is going to be the thing that keeps us as an am, that keeps us together, that helps us sustain ourselves. Sai in a practical sense, chesed helps us sustain ourselves, and sai in a schus sense, chesed is the ultimate schus. Now, aside from that, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai makes several takonos to, and they're halachis, but I believe that there is a theme over here, and this is not my own thought. People say this, but some of the takonos that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai makes, for example, is that they would blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah Shechal B'Shabbos in Yavne. That's takona number 1. That Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was masakin, sheyeh lulav nitel b'chol shivas yimei Sukkos. All 7 days of Sukkos, you shake lulav. And why is that? Zecher lemikdash. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, they would only shake lulav in the Beis HaMikdash for Shiva Yamim. In the Medina, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, you wouldn't shake it for 7 days. Says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, no, Zecher lemikdash, shake it 7 days. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asered eating chadash the whole day that we would usually bring a carbon, the second day of Pesach, and the reason was, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this is like the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's takanas range between zeicher l'churban and wishing for the churban to go away, like between facing the reality that we're going to live in a situation without a Beis Hamikdash and we need to acclimate and work around that, and also hoping and wishing that it could come back. L'mashal, the Gzeira of Chadash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, the tam is, Meheira Yibana Beis Hamikdash. V'yemru, Klal Yisrael say, Ishtakid, last year, K'shaya Bayis Charav, Achalni B'har Mizrach, we ate Chadash right away in the morning. And they won't know, V'la Yedu, Shebizman Shamikdash Kayim, that you're allowed to do it, but Bizman Shamikdash Kayim, you have to wait till the carbon is brought, as opposed to when the Mikdash is not Kayim, the Yom is the Matir. So it says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Meheira Yibana Beis Hamikdash, and we have to be chayshish for that. He has other more technical takanis that you can be mekabel Eidos HaChodesh Kol HaYom, and that's again just to make sure that Klal Yisrael will have their calendar set up properly as they go into Galus. And there's more. It's an entire list, and I'm not going to read all of them, but there's an akuda, there's a theme of remembering the Beis Hamikdash and of Meheira Yibana HaMikdash. So from Mitzad Echad to be comfortable and to know how to be Jews in Galus, and Mitzad Sheni to prepare and to be prepared that in the future the Beis Hamikdash will come back, and we should be our halachas should be matim for when the Beis Hamikdash comes back. Now, there's another interesting nekuda that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was Isaac in during his short tenure as a Nasi to again prepare Klal Yisrael for Galus. There's a letter that's called the Igeres Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. It's hard to know exactly where the first place this letter comes from, but there's a letter that's miyuchas to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that was published many times with different pirushim, and the letter, what the tachlis of the letter is to help. It's addressed to the Yidden who are living in Rome. That means Yidden who are brought back after the conquest of the Galus and went back to Rome, and we're going to live now amongst people of different faiths. And ostensibly the letter is referring to people of the Christian faith, and even though that's a little bit troubling because Christianity was not super popular yet in Rome at that time, it was more of a Jewish thing. So Balachari Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was writing to Jews who were going to live in Rome and would have to deal with confronting this. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai writes a whole letter that we still have today. I'll read a few snippets of it, but it starts off, Shimu Elai b'nei Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov Am Skula. He says, listen to me, children of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the chosen nation, which was probably hard to believe, at that moment in time. Right now we find ourselves in a situation of galus, and he says, and we find we're sitting with people, the kafar ba'achtus b'teres alekeinu v'lag al divrei chacham mad ma'oid, aval anu mekana meskenas Hashem, we're mekana the kin of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Masarin voice Lamisa Yidei Shayftenu Me'artzenu Ashehem Adalenu Akesem Me'irchem. And this nusach of the Igeres Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Kilu says that we put to death Yashka for his rising up against the Torah, which is again not such a clear point. V'nikver v'kever srucha b'pager muvas v'nevad min oilam ach Tomasai, says he in the letter, Nisha ba'aretz, the Tumah stayed around. And that's the tumah that we have to battle. And his Talmidim, he says, Svarim Lein Kates Al Ma'asav Shalehoyim Le'olam. They're writing book after book about his actions and activities, things that never took place at all. V'karu Shmei Mashiach, they called him Mashiach. V'nasan Torah Chadasha Asher Bada Milev Tomasei. And they're revealing a whole new Torah that he invented in his own heart. Ulahachlif es ha'achtus b'sheketz, to replace the achtus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu with a disgusting substitution. He says, Umali laharech b'tumah. He continues, and then he says, listen to me, my brethren who are dispersed amongst the nations. Don't listen to these people, these proselytizers who call themselves, messengers or missionaries or something of the sort, apostles who are coming to tell you about this new religion. He says, this is not the real thing. The real thing is what we always have been doing. And then you're a set pezura. It's like a letter full of chizuk and strengthening that Klal Yisrael, as dispersed and as separated from the Torah and from the Beis Hamikdash as they were when Galus was starting, and maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to look into the future and see how much more so it would become. He was warning them to stay strong and to stick to what they were taught before they were sent to Galus. And the signature on it is Just interesting. It's Eile Divrei HaMetzapeh Teshuas Yisrael, which again is very much a common theme in Klal Yisrael today, that we end off every speech or simcha or sefer hoping for Bias, Mashiach Tzidkenu B'meir B'yameinu. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right in the shadow of the burning of the Beis HaMikdash, is already signing his letter this way. Elu divrei ha-metzapeh teshuas Yisrael mevakesh la'Hashem Elokeinu al ezraseinu. It's Ezer ma'at ad sheyaveh ha-meir tzedek until Mashiach will come lanu ligo'aleinu v'limlech aleinu ad olam sela. Signed Yochanan ben Zakkai Yerushalayim. This is signed in the name of Yochanan ben Zakkai Yerushalayim, and this is another interesting nikud over here, where clearly Yochanan ben Zakkai is worried about usurping the power of the Nasi. HaKosev b'shem Rabbeinu Or Yisrael Rabbi Gamliel HaNasi. Writing in the name of Rabbeinu Or Yisrael of Gamliel HaNasi was much younger than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was attempting to reinstate as the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. So this is just another indication of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's role as the ultimate important chain in the link of the Mosrei HaTorah. The Rambam brings that in Akdamat B'Yisham Mishnayos, that of course Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the Arba'im Mosrei HaTorah, and this is, he played a pivotal role at a pivotal time, helping Klal Yisrael see through the transition from being in a Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael in a Beis HaMikdash to being a Klal Yisrael alone, abandoned in Galus, who would need to modify their mitzvahs and be able to stay strong, even when they were going to be tested by all sorts of other outside influences. Now, ultimately, the Sanhedrin that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai presides over is a weakened Sanhedrin. It's a Sanhedrin that's chutzlum kaimai, and like we spoke, the Gemara in Saita and elsewhere says v'kamta v'alisa la'amakim v'lamet sha'amakim geirim. Sanhedrin were not in the Lishkas Hagazah, is not in the Beis Hamikdash, is a diminished Sanhedrin. It doesn't have the powers of a regular Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin that doesn't have dayanim musmachim is a diminished Sanhedrin. Doesn't have the powers of a regular Sanhedrin. And although there are times and exceptions where possibly different einshim or different powers could be granted back to Sanhedrin, but as a general rule, they're limited in their powers. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the one who transitioned to that type of Sanhedrin and made the gzeiros that were necessary to hold the line. Now, Mitzvah Hashem, in the future at some point we'll discuss the idea of reinstating a Sanhedrin, which was a popular idea at different times through history. It relies on a Rambam and a need for smicha. There's actually a time during the Tkufas HaGa'onim when someone tried to suggest it, but the main time when it showed up and was a big fight was in Tzfas, in Yerushalayim, in the late 1500s between the Meribah Rav and the Maralbach, and that's something worthy of getting into. Later on in Eretz Yisrael, many years later, there was another attempt to reinstate the Sanhedrin. The Brisker Rav was against it. So Mitzvah Hashem, at a later date, we could talk about attempts to reinstate the Sanhedrin to its full glory. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is a chain in the link who held the line when Sanhedrin was diminished and allowed Klal Yisrael to continue even with a diminished Sanhedrin. And obviously the most appropriate ending to this would be that it's our fervent wish that Meher Yibana HaMikdash, and we'll have a Sanhedrin and the Lishkas Hagazahs properly b'mkaimah the way it's supposed to be.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.